device, so I've got a decent microphone now and I'm no longer forced to record audio on my phone. But I'm still trying to get the settings configured, so it might sound bad, but at least it will be consistently bad. And yes, I know I said I had an American Psycho video planned, and I swear I'm working on it, but I wanted to drop that on the movie's 25th anniversary on April 14th, so we're doing this one first. I hope you enjoy it.
What's a king without a crown? Take away his throne and gown. He could be the rabble or the Russian Tsar. Yeah! Judge each creature of our race by each feature in his face. Just look at him, I rest my case, well there you are.
There you are! So back in January of 2024, I was in a community theater production of The Mystery of Edwin Drood as Helena Landless. One of the Helenas, we were double cast. It was a lot of fun and one of my favorite shows I've ever been in. Here's the outcome of every show in case you were curious. I didn't get voted for anything, while the other Helena got both murder and detective on 2 different shows, but it's fine, I'm not salty about it at all. All joking aside, I loved Edwin Drood, but something about the story always bothered me, and it wasn't until after the production was over that it finally hit me. Edwin Drood is basically just Rupert Holmes' weird social experiment, and this is why. So The Mystery of Edwin Drood is a musical written by Rupert Holmes based on a novel by Charles Dickens that was never finished because Dickens died from a stroke in the middle of writing it. This is back when novels were published chapter at a time, which is still around today. Now we just call it fanfiction. The plot, as best as I can condense it, involves an orphan named Edwin Drood mysteriously disappearing on Christmas Day, presumably having been murdered. The primary suspect is Neville Landless, an orphan who has arrived from Ceylon, or modern-day Sri Lanka, alongside his twin sister Helena. Because he's in love with Drood's fiancée Rosa Budd, and Neville and Drood walk together after a dinner party on Christmas. But Drood's uncle, the choir master John Jasper, was also in love with Rosa, who was his music student, and is largely speculated to have murdered Drood so he could have Rosa for himself. The Reverend Septimus Crisparkle, whose name sounds like something out of the Hunger Games, manages to keep Neville out of jail, and then 6 months later, a detective named Dick Datchery shows up to investigate and finds out Jasper is an opium addict who likes to visit an opium den run by the Princess Puffer, who was also investigating Jasper, and that's about as much as Dickens ever got to. There's also some other minor characters like Rose's guardian Mr. Grugius, his assistant Bazzard, Durdles the alcoholic stonemason, Mr. Sapsy the auctioneer who becomes the mayor, some kid called Deputy, and other people who aren't in the musical and whom I don't have time to talk about.
I don't understand a word you just said.
I'm sorry if that's all too much information to process at once, but I promise it'll make more sense as we go on. Anyway, Dickens only managed to get 6 out of 12 installments done before he kicked it, so the novel ended on a complete cliffhanger. This musical is an attempt to finish the story and give it a satisfying conclusion. It does this through copious amounts of fourth wall breaks, high-energy song and dance numbers, excellent comedy, and ultimately allowing the audience to choose several aspects of the ending. They get to vote on the true identity of the disguised detective Dick Datchery, the identity of the murderer, and 2 people who fall in love at the end. Yes, they do allow you to pair the twins together. And Rosa with her abuser. And Rosa with the guy who used to be engaged to her mom. This whole song is just crack shipping at its finest. Now, there's no getting around the fact that John Jasper has long since been suspected of being Drood's murderer. A lot of people, from the artist to Dickens' friend to his own son, were just flat out told that he was supposed to be. Additionally, there are plenty of clues in the novel pointing to Jasper being the murderer. For me, the most damning piece of evidence is the fact that the Princess Puffer warns Edwin that Ned is in danger, and Jasper is the only person who refers to Edwin as Ned. It's safe to assume that Dickens intended for Jasper to be the murderer and wrote his story accordingly. Apparently, he also wanted the story to end with Rosa marrying a naval officer named Mr. Tartar, Crisparkle marrying Helena, and Neville having died in the process of helping Tartar find the killer. Well, that's certainly an ending. In the musical, Jasper is the only character who sings a confession song every night, since he's always present at the scene of the crime. Durdles explains after his confession that the real killer knocks Drood out. Jasper shows up and strangles him, but doesn't kill him, and drags him off to the tune of Mayor Sapsy's late wife. However, the characters in the musical are constantly telling the audience to not vote Jasper as the murderer. Some productions won't even count any votes he gets, and supposedly he was never chosen as murderer during the entirety of the original Broadway run. The reasoning for this is that if you go with the most obvious choice, then there's no mystery. And yeah, going for the most obvious suspect might ruin any aspect of mystery the show has, but the truth is, there isn't much of a mystery here to begin with. The nature of a murder mystery, or any mystery for that matter, is that finding the culprit is the entire focus of the story. The most enjoyable part of any mystery is trying to put the clues together and figure out who did it. But this version of Edwin Drood has very few actual clues, and the ones it does have all point to Jasper as the culprit. Let's look over the evidence for a minute. For one, we have Rosa's clasp that was given to Edwin and that Datchery found in Jasper's home, indicating that Jasper had contact with Edwin at some point after the dinner party. In the end, this is revealed to be the result of Jasper moving Edwin to the crypt after he was presumably killed, but Datchery makes the logical conclusion that it was because Jasper was the one who killed Drood. There are also some clues pointing in Neville's direction, such as the fact that he was the last person seen with Drood and has blood all over him. But those are easily dismissible, with the former being that anyone could have encountered Drood after his walk with Neville and the real murderer absolutely did, and the latter is explained by Neville that he was just getting beaten up by a bunch of angry white men when Sapsi points it out. And you want to know the other piece of evidence pointing to Neville? Edwin's blood-soaked jacket that Bassard found under the rock by the river where, which Turtles admitted was placed there by Jasper in order to frame Neville. Y'all, if your only evidence is forged evidence, then you don't really have evidence. Actually, I guess the code is worth talking about, in that it also doesn't really provide any actual major clues either. Edwin borrowed the coat from Jasper after the dinner party, and only Neville was there to witness him putting it on. So it's entirely possible that the murderer mistook Edwin for Jasper, but that only ends up becoming the case for two characters. All in all, most of what there is in the musical points to Jasper being the killer because that's the way the original story was going. Trying to stick a variety of different endings into a show that is clearly pushing you towards one specific ending doesn't really work out. It ultimately leaves the audience with a lot of guesswork and just going with whatever they think makes the most sense. To better illustrate my point, let's directly compare Edwin Drood to another Rupert Holmes murder mystery, Curtains. Light spoiler warning here, Curtains is basically your typical murder mystery set under the backdrop of a Boston musical theater troupe trying to get their show Robin Hood onto Broadway, when their leading lady is murdered and Lieutenant Frank Chaffee is sent to investigate. I was also in this show my sophomore year of high school as Sasha, the orchestra conductor. One of the Sashas that was in the double casting. Fun fact, unlike Drood where Rupert Holmes wrote basically everything, here he just wrote the book based on the original concept by Peter Stone, the guy who wrote the book for 1776, because Stone died before he finished the book for Curtains. Oh my god, just like the other one. The music was actually written by legendary songwriting team John Kander and Fred Ebb, except Ebb also died before finishing the music, so Holmes and Kander had to write some additional lyrics. And the orchestrator Michael Gibson died while working on it. Jesus Christ, Rupert, are you cursed or something? You can tell he does some music for Curtains since in both shows he uses the phrase high-low. It's a Rupert Holmes thing. Anyway, Curtains works like most other murder mysteries, and that Lieutenant Chaffee, who's one of the best detective characters ever written, and I'll fight you on that, has absolutely no idea who the murderer is, so the answer isn't obvious at first. There's a lot of clues and red herrings, and a lot of different people to throw suspicion on. In the end, the murderers, there were actually two who have completely opposite motivations, were discovered by Chaffee having to put the clues together bit by bit and eventually revealing the truth to the audience. It works as a mystery because the mystery comes in the fact that you have to keep guessing who the murderer is. But with Edwin Drood, there isn't as much of that mystery, primarily because a lot of your suspects have no reason to be suspects. See, the first murder in Curtains was the lead actress, which was done with the intention of shutting down the show. But since Robin Hood was getting slammed by critics and the producer was blackmailing the entire cast, no one really wanted the show to go to Broadway save for a few people. This gave the majority of characters a solid motivation for murder, which was the case for one of the killers. The other killer had a reason for wanting the show to keep running, which actually turned out to be pretty tragic and is why their chosen victim is very different. But Edwin Drood? Very few of these characters actually have a good reason to commit murder. Jasper and Neville probably have the strongest motivations, with the two of them both wanting Rosa for themselves and not knowing that she and Edwin had ended their engagement earlier that day. But Neville comes with the caveat that he's intentionally supposed to be a red herring in the original story, with the idea being that Jasper used his hot temper and knowledge of his love for Rosa in order to shift the blame for Edwin's disappearance in this direction. In the musical, this goes so far as to have Turtles reveal that Jasper intentionally placed Drood's coat under a rock where he had been walking with Neville in order to frame him. Furthermore, Jasper's motivation for targeting Neville in particular is due to his own racism, since the Landwis twins are from Ceylon. A British subject is entirely about how they're seen as outcasts due to their origin, and Jasper even directly follows his song by ranting to Sapsi about how heathen and uncivilized Neville is. Neville even gets arrested the day after Drood's disappearance and is only saved by Helena and Chris Sparkle standing up for him. So if you vote for Neville, you're kind of validating Jasper's racism, which is not good. Remember the voting results from earlier? Neville actually got voted murderer at one of our shows. And while that did mean I got to have fun being really dramatic in the background of his confession while playing Helena, it just kind of left me with a sour taste in my mouth. Chris Sparkle's motivation is the same as Jasper and Neville, but with the added kick that he sees Rosa as a manifestation of her late mother, whom he's once engaged to, which is just all kinds of creepy. Also, why would you have the same motive 3 times? That's just boring. I'm pretty sure this wasn't even in the book, so there's no real reason to put it in. But what's more interesting about Chris Sparkle is that he actively defends Neville after his arrest and gets him let go. You figure he'd want someone else to go to prison for his crime, but I guess he just couldn't go that far as to frame someone else. Furthermore, Chris Sparkle's character is a bit more layered than it might seem. Yes, his attraction towards Rosa is really gross, but you have to remember it's directly related to the fact that he was engaged to someone who married another man, had a child with him, and died a sudden tragic death by falling off a cliff and drowning. The way Chris Sparkle delivers his bit does make it come across like he may have been the one to kill her, but I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt and assuming that it really was an accident. And Chris Sparkle is spending a lot of time around Rosa, which definitely doesn't help in that regard. You might remember that I talked about this in my Our Flag Means Death video. Constantly being around the object of your obsessive attachment will only make that attachment worse. In a way, this makes Chris Sparkle's character a lot more tragic. Indeed, a lot of Drood's characters are quite tragic, but just put a pin in that and we'll get back to it later. Moving on to Helena, I find she's one of the most interesting characters in the show, as basically everything she does is motivated by helping Neville in some way or another. She calls out Sapsy for arresting him with no real evidence. If she's voted Datchery, she investigates in order to clear his name, and if she's voted as murderer, she reveals she killed Drood so her brother wouldn't be able to seek revenge on him. In her confession, Helena specifically refers herself as a sister and mother to Neville, which highlights how she prioritizes her safety above anything else. I love that about Helena. I love protective characters, especially protective older sibling characters. It reminds me of my own protective older sister. I think it can be quite interesting to explore just how far someone will go to keep the people they love safe. But the thing is, killing Drood doesn't actually help Neville, just the opposite in fact. Helena literally gets her brother arrested. Did you seriously not think that people were going to suspect Neville, especially after she warned him to be careful? Because it's not like Helena isn't aware that Cloisterham has a racism problem. Her lines in A British Subject make it very clear that she is aware. Having someone whose entire character centers on protecting her brother make a move that jeopardizes his life makes absolutely no sense. I know love can make people do risky and irrational things, but there's a line between irrational and just flat out idiotic. So while I do like Helena as a character, her motivation for murder is shaky at best. Bazzard, who is now Chris Sparkle's assistant since Mr. Grugius is no longer here, has the most meta-theatrical of confessions. His actor Philip Bax has been stuck doing minor roles, and has never really been given a chance in the spotlight, and his role in this show is equally small. He killed Drood specifically because he wanted a chance to play a bigger part, which just is a little too hard, doesn't it? But of all the ways to give Bazzard a bigger role, having him be a murderer is not one of the best ones. Do you really want this guy to get hanged? This is why Bazzard tends to be a very popular candidate for Datchery, because people understandably want him to contribute more without having to kill someone. People love this character, and rightfully so. Bazzard has some of the best comedy in the whole show, and he's so earnest in his love for theater that you can't help but root for him. He got so much love during my production that he was the only person who got picked for something every single show. Datchery the first night and the Lover on the other three. Just look at him! He's so cute! How could you not want good things for him? Rosebud and Princess Puff are an interesting pair of choices since they both killed Drood because they thought he was Jasper due to the coat thing I mentioned earlier. Both of them were trying to protect Rosa from Jasper's advances, which is completely understandable. But since only 2 people of 8 murderers have this particular aspect to their motivation, it raises a question about whether or not the coat thing is even necessary. When it first comes up, you get the impression that it's important enough and might cause such a misunderstanding, especially since it's heavily implied that Jasper drugged the port with laudanum and that would completely mess with everyone's perceptions. But how many of these characters would actually know it's Jasper's coat? The only one who knows for certain is Neville since he was there when Drood put it on, and why would Helena, Bazzard, Chris Sparkle, or Durdles want to kill Jasper? None of them know he's in the rose and they don't have any real reasons beyond that. It makes me wonder why Holmes even put the damn thing in there to begin with. And then there's Durdles, who witnesses the murder and reveals the killer's true identity while also explaining Jasper's role in the event. He killed Drood because he got drunk, saw Drood getting up after supposedly being killed and thought he was a ghost, so he clunked him over the head. It's all very silly, since Durdles is primarily a comedic character. He actually got voted for murderer once during my production. He and Jasper did a little do-si-do while he sang a reprise of Off to the Races. It was hilarious. Durdles is actually one of 2 characters in the show, the other being Rosa, who directly called the fact that they have no real reason to want Edwin dead, which is why his confession is so conveniently propelled. Are you starting to see the problem here? Deciphering a legitimate motive for any of these characters is really difficult because there's very little of anything in the story that implicates them as a killer. I was struggling to put together a good motive for any of them after several months of analysis. How is the audience going to come up with one in less than 2 hours? You're effectively throwing a series of ideas at a bunch of people, most of whom don't do deep analysis on the media they consume very often, and saying, here you go, have fun figuring it out. They're going solely based on how they feel about certain characters as opposed to what actually makes sense. And this, to me, is ultimately the sticking point of Edwin Drood as a concept. When you leave the ending of a show up to the audience, you leave it up to them to interpret these characters. And that's not necessarily a great idea, because if you watch my last video essay, you know that audiences cannot really be trusted with that sort of thing. I talked about this a lot in the Our Flag Means Death video, especially when it came to Izzy Hands. The amount of people who were completely misinterpreting this character as just a smart, precious baby, and completely ignoring all of his terrible and abusive behavior was pretty frickin' high. Higher than you might expect if you haven't been in media discourse for very long, but if you're like me and this kind of thing is your bread and butter, was the exact opposite of surprising. There are plenty of people who will completely ignore a character's horrific actions in order to justify standing them. You might be shocked at the idea that someone would unironically ship Jasper and Rosa, but I'm not. I know for a fact that someone in the audience would ship an abuse victim with their abuser, because people do that. People do that all the time. You might remember that in the ARF Live video, I specifically referenced an article in which the author tried to claim that there was no wrong interpretations of Izzy as a character, which is just flat out wrong. You can't interpret this character as not being a bad person, at least in the first season. The harsh reality is that this is objectively wrong. Shipping abusive relationships is wrong. Denying that abusive behavior is in fact abusive is wrong, and if you try to claim otherwise, you are wrong. End of discussion. And if you want a world in which you don't have to be subjected to the criticism of this trend in your behavior alongside it, you don't get that. Why don't you grow up and come join the rest of us in the real world? I promise it's not as bad as it seems. The worst part of all this is when creators themselves are the ones doing it. It's bad enough when fans romanticize and glorify abusive relationships, but it's even worse when they're supported by the story itself. This is why I got so heated about Izzy in the last video, because if it just been fans saying these sorts of things, I could have just chalked it up to them completely missing the point. But the writers jumped in on this for a good bit in season 2, and only made these people even more insufferably loud about the fact that their tastes in storytelling are problematic, to say the least. Edwin Drood also has his problem to an extent. If Jasper and Rosa are selected as lovers, their dialogue together has Rosa actually address Jasper with a fair amount of kindness and admiration, instead of telling him to go jump in a well like I would've. And it's honestly worse if she even gets with Chris Sparkle, because they're not only okay with the fact that he was engaged to her mom, but they're very enthusiastic about it. These are two relationships where the entire show has been screaming at you, don't support this, but if push comes to shove, they end up supporting it. If the dialogue had been, this is gross, but I guess we're doing it anyway because y'all are freaks, like it was with the Landless twins, that would have been comedic gold, but for some reason we didn't go that route. The thing is that giving the audience what they want is not always a good idea, because a lot of the time, what the audience wants is not what they deserve. I've seen way too many franchises start off really good and then fall completely ass backwards because they gave in to audience demands, from making abuse victims make out with their abusers to torturing black women for the drama. Anyone who tries to claim these things are in any way a good idea is just wrong, plain and simple. And this is especially annoying when it comes to Drew, because unlike a single reader choose-your-own-adventure story, the decision comes down to the majority opinion of a lot of people. So God forbid all these people come together for a matinee, and next thing you know you'll be hearing Rosa have to sing a love duet with Walmart Claude Frollo over here. Apparently some people really hate Rosa for whatever reason, as if she hasn't suffered enough already. Yeah, it's finally time to take that pin out. With the exception of Jasper, pretty much all the options for murderer are actually quite tragic characters. Bazzer just wants a chance to prove that he's a good actor and can handle a larger role and won't publish his play because he doesn't think he's good enough at playwriting. Isn't that a mode? Rosa is an orphan trapped in an arranged marriage with a creepy music teacher who wrote a song about how much he's into her. Neville may be a jerk sometimes, but he and Helen are survivors of child abuse and are now living in a completely new country with people who are openly racist and hostile to them. Puffer was Rosa's nanny until she was betrayed by a man who pimped her out to his friends, and when her looks faded, she had to sell drugs in order to survive. Durdles is an alcoholic who killed Drew by accident, and we already talked about Chris Sparkle and all of his baggage. These are all characters that you can feel bad for in some capacity. That's why having to vote one of them as murderer makes me feel like complete garbage, because I really like these characters. I don't want to condemn one of them to death for killing someone, especially if it's by accident or because they thought they were killing someone who kind of had it coming. Because no matter who you pick, someone is going to lose. Someone has to be a killer. It turns out Drood isn't actually dead, but we don't know that when we vote. We've already established him as dead for the evening, and only the actress coming back out of nowhere reveals him to still be alive. It gets especially worse if, say, one of the Landless twins is a killer and the other has to watch them get arrested. Or if Puffer has to watch Rosa get arrested or vice versa. No one really gets to win in this scenario except if Jasper gets arrested, which is just further evidence that voting him murderer is the most logical explanation, but no one ever does that. It's just a lose-lose scenario all around. Now, I want to stop and clarify something here. I know it sounds like I've been pretty harsh on Edwin Drood so far, but in actuality, I have a lot of positive feelings towards him. It's got some of the best songs I've heard in any musical. Like, Both Sides of the Coin has rhyme schemes, wordplay, and fast singing that would make Lin-Manuel Miranda shake in his boots. Garden Path to Hell is this really intense song about deceit and forced prostitution. The Name of Love is one of the most emotionally intense songs I've heard since Santa Fe. It's really good. I didn't lay out all that analysis as a criticism, but more to explain why Drood is the way it is. As time went on, I realized that I see it less as a musical and more like a social experiment in musical form. And if you look at Drood as a social experiment, you can start to find a lot of value in it. There is a question to be explored of why people tend to vote the way they do. See, Rupert Holmes made the observation in the creator notes of Drood's script that Bazard is the most popular candidate for Datchery because people like him and want him to have a bigger role. In his words, people are making a logical decision so much as they're making an emotional one. And that pretty much describes every decision that people make in Edwin Drood. The person who is voted as murderer mostly depends not on who is logically most likely to have killed Drood, but who the audience thinks is the most likely. That's why the lack of evidence pointing to anyone other than Jasper really isn't a concern for most of them, and why the chairman shaming the audience into not picking him is an effective decision. It also comes back to the fact that this is indeed a group vote, so everyone gets a say in the outcome. It's different compared to an ethical dilemma posed by a thought experiment or single-player video game, where only one person's opinions matter, and a lot more akin to being on a jury. However, unlike in a jury, there's not nearly as many opportunities to debate with your peers on the potential options, and there's a lot more options to consider. Basically, the question poses, what do you answer when the outcome depends on the opinions of multiple people with whom you have limited communication and little to no knowledge of their decisions? The answer ends up being, I'll just pick what I think is best and hope everyone else votes accordingly, which is exactly why group decisions have to involve some level of communication, especially when it comes to important things like life and death, because you can't assume that everyone else is going to vote accordingly, and even if you do discuss beforehand, you'll never really know for certain what everyone else voted until you literally see it for yourself. It's like Survivor if the audience were the ones voting contestants out. If the characters were the one voting, it would obviously look very different, since they don't have the knowledge of the others that the audience does. But the outcome of any given vote isn't going to be perfect, because regardless of evidence, people still allow their biases to get in the way of decision making. Because people aren't perfect, so expecting them to handle these kinds of situations in a 100% rational manner just isn't possible. And that makes sense, because a lot of things in life aren't 100% rational either. We can't really expect computers to handle these scenarios either, because there's a human element to it. Sometimes motivation does play an important role in determining a person's guilt and level of punishment. It begs a larger question around the systems of justice we have in place, like whether or not hinging someone's fate on people who don't know the law very well is a good idea. Some writers might dismiss the people who question these ideas as just being stuck in their old ways. But a better idea would be to explore the nuance in that question and have an actual debate around both sides of the coin, haha. Ethical dilemmas are interesting, because they ask how you might act in a particular scenario with little time to make a very important decision. I think they're worth debating because they're often applicable to real life in ways you might not expect, though there usually is a correct way to answer that might not always be obvious. In Drood's case, the decision to vote purely based on emotions and gut instinct might force you to re-examine your own biases and consider why you're voting the way you are. I actually want to hear from you guys on this. If you've ever participated in voting for a performance of Drood, which way did you vote and why? Please feel free to share in the comments. Any way you slice it, I think Edwin Drood is a great show. It's fun, it's silly, it's intense, and it's very thought-provoking. And the completely out-of-nowhere ending does give a fair amount of payoff since Drood is alive and the murderer is going to get a lesser charge, so they might still make it out alive. Someone got a chance to investigate and potentially clear Neville's name, and 2 people are now in a happy relationship. Maybe. Also, everyone now knows that Jasper is a total banana nut muffin, so he'll probably lose a lot of social standing, which he completely deserved. It's not unlike the ending to Ace Attorney Justice for All, where everything works out in the end, but you still get a chance to think about whether or not you would have made the right decision. But ethical dilemmas and judicial philosophy in the lawyer game is a discussion for another time. All this is to say, Edwin Drood is definitely a show worth checking out. If you guys ever had the chance to watch it, you really should. Go, have fun, laugh, question your life decisions, jam out to some really good music, and enjoy your chance for audience participation. I really wish more shows would do that. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a fantastic day.
So